This week's video is a bit different. I am comparing some of my favourite 35mm compact cameras. And this roundup includes quite a mix of different kinds of cameras, including rangefinders, zone focus cameras, fully automatic point and shoots. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they are pocketable. Now, that term is potentially a bit contentious. Pocketable depends entirely on how big your pockets are, but the idea is that you should be able to carry it with you anywhere you go without taking a separate shoulder bag or handbag or whatever. This is not meant to be a comprehensive analysis of every single compact camera made. It's very subjective, and hopefully the comment section can be used as a way to have a discussion and also add anything that's been missed and just share what your favorite compact cameras are and why. So let's start with the camera I have in my hands here, the Olympus Mu V or 5, also known as the Stylus 105. It's the only zoom camera in the lineup, and in some ways its zoom lens is both its strength and its weakness. It covers quite an impressive range, 38mm to 105mm. However, it's a slow lens. It starts at about 5.6, and I think at its longest it's f11.5. If you're using this camera, you really want to be using a faster film. I'd say a minimum of 400, ideally 800 unless you're in sunny conditions. There is a flash on the camera, it works well. And of course, the Olympus Mu 5 is overshadowed by its more expensive cousin, the Olympus Mu 2, which has the prime lens. However, I feel like that's such a well-reviewed camera, and to be quite honest, quite a hyped camera, that I didn't want to include it in this roundup. Another interesting aspect about the Mu 5 is that it is described as an all-weather camera, which is written here. However, this camera came out in 2002. I guess there's a very good chance that the weather sealing could have been compromised over the last couple of decades. So I personally wouldn't trust that, but your camera, your risk, I guess. For a zoom lens, I actually find the images very sharp. I can't say I've ever used this camera with the lens extended, but it's there if you need it, and that's great. So next up is an offering from Fujifilm. This is the DL Super Mini, the Mark I version. This camera is also known as the Cardia Mini Tiara, I believe. A pretty awful name. Neither of the names are that catchy. It's in fact the third smallest 35mm camera ever made. This is one of my favorite cameras for a few reasons. The slightly annoying, concerning grating sound that you hear when the lens goes on and off, it's not one of the reasons, but it has a 28mm lens with an aperture of 3.5 at its widest. I really like the look of this camera. I've heard it referred to as a Sardine cam, which I think is a bit unfair. To me, it's more like as if Fujifilm had a love affair with a mid-2000s MacBook Pro, and this was the result. The best thing about it, in my opinion, is the lens. It takes really sharp results. In fact, I read online that people actually rehouse the lenses from these so they can shoot them in their end-mount cameras once the electronics ultimately die. I believe the fastest shutter speed you can get on this camera is 1/800th of a second, which is pretty good. This camera also has some interesting focusing features. It has a manual focus mode, which you choose by going to the menu at the back, selecting the manual focus mode, and then scroll through the different distance options. I think what's a little bit annoying is that once you've taken the photo, it resets back to the original setting. You can also choose landscape mode, and there's also a snap focus mode. This camera also has a feature that is shared with only one other camera in the group, and that's the way that the film, when you load it through this little port here, the back door can actually open up completely, but we won't do that. You can see here the film slides in, and when you load the film, it empties the canister so that the whole roll is on the internal spool. Shouldn't have done that. Literally 2 minutes later, and as you take a shot, it slowly respools it. So why does it do that, you might ask? Well, I'll answer with a quick anecdote. I work as a cinematographer, and sometimes I'm on a set with still photographers. On one occasion of lunch, I happened to have this with me. And just to make conversation, I showed it to the stills photographer, who is an experienced and really good photographer. However, the first thing they did was open the back to see if I had film in it, and I don't know what they were thinking. They didn't know what they were thinking. They felt pretty embarrassed afterwards, and luckily anything I'd already shot was effectively safe because it had already been taken back into the film canister. Now, I've mentioned that this is a shot lens. Sometimes I've noticed that the focus only really locks onto whatever is in the center of the frame, and I've had quite a few images ruined because it's focused on the background, not my subject. You could probably get around that by focusing and then recomposing. It has one clever tool that I haven't seen in another camera. I'm sure it exists, but if you cover the flash, which is on the left hand side here, there's a little sensor that will flash red in the window so that you know your flash will be partly obscured or completely obscured. So that's really helpful. The lowdown is that the Fujifilm DL Super Mini is a very capable Sardine camera. The Ricoh GR1S, probably one of the more expensive cameras in the lineup, and definitely one of the sleekest. See just how narrow the body is there. It's barely any thicker than canister 35mm. I actually believe that this is the thinnest ever 35mm camera made. The Ricoh GR has a 28mm f2.8 lens, has a built-in flash, it takes sharp images, it focuses instantly. It doesn't have many buttons, but the buttons it does have are all very useful, such as the toggle on, off, flash selector. As an exposure compensation dial, on the top you can use this button here to change between focusing modes, and this button here is a self-timer. You can actually use small filters with this camera through an adapter made by Ricoh, which opens up the possibility of using things like coloured filters for black and white film or polarizer. It's not very common and it can be a bit pricey if you find the adapter. If you do use filters with this camera, you have to use the exposure compensation dial to counter the loss of light through the filter. It's not done through the lens. The Ricoh GR1S is a street photographer's darling, partly for its 28mm lens, and partly because it's often associated with the camera used by Japanese photographer Daido Moriyama. I love how elegant and how minimal this camera is, especially the all-black version. I think if this camera was a character in a movie, it would have to be a chain-smoking, red wine-drinking Parisian in a French New Wave film. This camera is not without its faults, and if we go back to our Parisian analogy, eventually it's just going to give something of a Gorlick shrug and stop working. The most common issues reported with this camera are the LCD screen, which eventually will just pack in. When that stops working, you can still use the camera. However, it won't be obvious which focusing mode you're actually in. A second issue which I read about is the focusing motor, and when that goes, if it is possible to fix it, it comes at a steep price, and there are only a handful of people who are willing to do any work on electronic cameras. That said, all electronic cameras probably have an expiry date, so the best thing to do is enjoy using it while you can, and treat every roll of film like it might be your last, because it might be. Next up is the somewhat unassuming Canon Sureshot Esprit. This camera has more aliases than Snoop Dogg. It's also known as the Sureshot M, the Prima Mini, the Canon Autoboy F, I believe, in Japan. And it also comes in commemorative editions, or at least one commemorative edition. This is the 1994 USA World Cup edition. It's called Canon 11, but looking at it, I'm pretty sure it is exactly the same buttons, same lens, same functions, but just with quite a nice commemorative bag, which you can see here. What can I say about this camera? It has a 32mm f3.5 lens. It is cheap, maybe not the commemorative edition, but the regular edition. You could probably pick them up for less than 30, 40 pounds, euros, dollars, whatever. Let's just say 2 rolls of Porsche 400 from a thrift store, second-hand shop, car boot sale, whatever. And it's a really good camera, and by that I mean there aren't particularly high expectations when you come across a cheap plastic camera like this. And to be honest, I'd rather buy a second-hand camera like this than something like the new Ricoh Snappy K1, branded as a Kodak camera. And that's because I don't think the lens or build quality is going to be as good as this. The one downside, in my opinion, of this camera is the fact that it has a top shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, which is not awful, but it does limit you to slightly slower speed films, especially if you're shooting on a bright sunny day, because you don't want it to be shooting at f/16 the entire time where diffraction is likely to kick in. So the summary for this camera, it's the plastic fantastic of the group. If you come across one in working condition, why not buy one? You could take it skiing, take it rock climbing, whatever you want to do. Just take it for a walk and there's no real concern about it getting broken or stolen. Next up is a zone focusing camera. This one by Lomography is the LCA. It is the camera that pretty much kickstarted Lomography, and it spearheaded the shoot from the hip, don't think, just shoot ethos. It's a pretty plasticky camera. It feels like it's made from quite cheap components. Things kind of creak a little bit. Now it's not even shooting for some reason. There we go. I quite like this little logo here. I have no idea who this guy is, but it's pretty cool. So in terms of the zone focus, you have 4 options on the side. You have the close focus at 0.8 meters, 1.5 meters, 3 meters, and then infinity. Now, the way that I would use this camera is to leave the aperture set to automatic and let it work out the calculation based on the maximum shutter speed. This camera is also the predecessor of the newly released but much more expensive, albeit probably equally underwhelming, Lomo MCA. Now the lens isn't awful, but it vignettes a lot, it's not the sharpest, and it's not an everyday all-purpose camera for those reasons. However, particularly when you use black and white film, it does feel like it's transporting your subjects into the past. And I like that, and I think it's fun, it's different. The zone focusing doesn't really help you out too much. It doesn't prevent you from making mistakes. That's the charm of Lomography. It permits you to make mistakes. If anything, it encourages it. And I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that Lomography partly inspired the original Instagram filters. And when Instagram was released, the starting gun for the race towards digital perfection had only just been fired. I feel like that race has now come to a conclusion with 50 plus megapixel cameras being the standard. And that's not even opening the debate to how AI has encroached into photography. But if you keep it in mind, it makes a lot more sense as to why Lomography would update the LCA with their new MCA camera. It's very much a homage to this older piece of equipment. And in a way, I think the story has now come full circle. So to summarize the Lomo LCA, it encourages you to be spontaneous. It makes images which are full of lo-fi personality and nostalgia. And it also transports your subjects back to a bygone era. The Ricoh FF1, a much less premium version than the Ricoh GR. Okay, so while editing this video, I realized that I was quite tired towards the end, and I've re-recorded the last 2 sections just to inject some more energy into the comparison. The Ricoh FF1 is also a zone focusing or scale focusing camera. It has focus marks at 0.9 meters, 1.5 meters, 2.5 meters, 5 meters, and infinity, giving you an extra option over the LCA. One unique feature that this camera has that none of the others in the lineup offer is this thread right here, which allows you to mount a shutter release cable. And this is really useful if you're putting your camera on a tripod and want to take a landscape shot, for example, or even a self-portrait if you have a long enough shutter release cable. If we consider the design of the camera, the body itself is quite plasticky, the lens is mounted in metal, and it does feature quite a nice drawbridge style retractable lens to keep it nice and safe when you're not using it, and also make it very thin and streamlined. The lens itself at f/2.8 is pretty fast for such a compact camera. However, the highest speed film you can use on this camera is ISO 400, which means that you want to have the option to use a faster lens in order to work in lower light environments. Now this camera has a maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, which is not bad. One thing to keep in mind if you're using this camera with something in a hot shoe, whether that's a flash or a meter for example, is that the camera recognizes that there's something there and automatically defaults to the flash sync speed of 1/60th of a second, which is great if you're actually using the flash, but if the flash is turned off, you might find that there's a bit too much motion blur for your taste. Now obviously this camera isn't a rangefinder, so looking in the viewfinder you'll just see a very simple framing outline. The viewfinder is pretty comfortable to use, even if, like me, you wear glasses. However, it does have a tendency to flare up if shooting in backlight. Another thing to be aware of with this camera is that without the two LR44 batteries that are required to power it, you may think that the shutter is firing, but in fact it isn't, which can quite easily lead to a wasted film. So to summarize, if you're into zone focusing cameras, and if you're okay with a wrist strap on the left-hand side, the Ricoh FF1 is a hidden gem. Next up is the world's smallest rangefinder camera, the Olympus XA. The XA has a cult-like status, and it was designed by legendary Japanese designer Yoshihisa Mitani. Apologies to my Japanese-speaking audience, I'm sure it's not pronounced like that. An interesting anecdote about this camera is that when Mitani approached the head of Olympus's lens division to explain that he wanted to build a camera this thin and put a 35mm lens into it, he was told that it couldn't be done. They'd have to choose something wider. However, Mitani felt like the 35mm focal length was the perfect option for a camera that you could take with you every day. It allows you to take photos of a group of people, but also a portrait of a single person without it being too unflattering thanks to the distortion that you would get on a wider lens. Now, it's fantastic that Olympus were able to create such a tiny rangefinder camera. However, there are two potential shortcomings. The first being the incredibly short focus throw that gets you from close focus at 0.85 meters to infinity. And the second issue is the very short base length between the viewfinder window and the rangefinder patch. To understand why the base length matters in a rangefinder camera, it's worth understanding something called the effective base length. And the effective base length is basically a calculation made by taking your base length, or the distance between the viewfinder and a rangefinder port, and multiplying that by the magnification of the viewfinder. High effective base length correlates to increased focusing accuracy. So for example, a Leica M4 has a physical base length of approximately 68.5 millimeters and a magnification of 0.72. This results in a base length of 49.32 millimeters. The Olympus XA, however, has a very short base length of about 16 millimeters and a viewfinder magnification of 0.6, which means that its effective base length is 9.6 millimeters, which means that it can be tricky to focus accurately, especially at wide apertures of 2.8 or f4. Now, how much this matters to you will depend on various factors, including your film speed choice, the aperture you like to shoot at, the amount of light you have, and of course the distance between you and your subject. Now, the fact that you can use films of up to ISO 800 means that you shouldn't have too much of a problem of using a slightly smaller aperture and getting things in focus. The fastest shutter is 1/500th of a second, and you can also use an add-on flash with this camera. You have two choices, the A11 and the A16, which mount to the side here. However, I haven't included the flash in this comparison because once you've added that small brick onto the side, it's no longer a pocketable camera. The lens on the XA is not bad at all. It's not the sharpest in the group, but of course sharpness isn't everything. There's a bit of vignetting that's apparent at f2.8, which won't bother a lot of people. However, one thing that might put some people off this camera is the shutter mechanism. Now, it's very silent, which combined with the 1/500th of a speed shutter make this a really useful camera for street photography. Some people have complained that the shutter is too sensitive and that they can't get through a roll of film without accidentally firing off a few shots. However, I've not personally had this issue, and I feel like it has just the right amount of resistance to triggering the shutter. On the bottom of the camera, you have three more functions: a battery check, which I wouldn't recommend using too often as it does drain the battery, a 1.5 stop exposure compensation, which I think is very useful on compact cameras, and also a self-timer. So to summarize, the Olympus XA, despite being released in 1979, was ahead of the game when it came to engineering. And if you're okay with the feather-light touch of the electromagnetic shutter button, and also the somewhat unreliable rangefinder patch, this is a great option, especially for street shooters. So I think that's about everything I wanted to say for this roundup. Probably wondering if I have a favorite, if there's one that I would keep above all else, and it's probably the Ricoh GR1S. For me, it has the extra features, functions. I like the form factor, but to be honest, they're all great cameras. So if you were able to get your hands on any of these, I don't think you'll be disappointed. If you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing or leave a like. There's a video coming out very soon. It's a comparison of a new 800 film stock called Sanscolor 800. I'm comparing it against Portrait 800 and the film inside disposable cameras. See you there.